thanks for coming to the Interpersonal Division's 5 years out panel. I forgot to tell the panelists that they were being videotaped and that it was being put on the internet. So, until just today, so surprise. for years and years to come. We can look back and watch it. I think it's a great idea because you can show it to your grad classes, your undergrad classes, and use it for future reference. And we have, obviously, a wonderful slate of panelists today. Some of the, not only the top scholars in interpersonal communication, but in the discipline in general. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history of interpersonal communication and the future of it, what they see as some potential challenges that we face. And Grant Burleson got the flu yesterday at the business meeting, and so he flew home this morning. He sends his apologies, and we were joking. We were asking if anybody wanted to stand in for Grant. You're sure welcome. Any takers? Anybody want to impersonate Grant?
Rodney,
Rodney can do it. Hey, Rodney can do it. Come on, Reynolds, get up here.
But today we have on our panel today we have Dr. David Ragoo from the University of Arizona, Dr. Charles Berger from the University of California, Davis, Dr. Anita Evangelisi from the University of Texas at Austin, Grant Burleson, who was going to be here, and then Dr. Sandra Petronio from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. So, Judy, you want to begin?
Okay. In thinking about this issue, I was brought back to a panel we did about, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. It was the Judy Trent series that was on At the Helm. Were any of you here present for that? Okay, well, a few of us, I guess it ages or dates people. They're not so anxious to admit to that. But the purpose of that series at the time was to talk about important issues, important trends, and I spoke about one particular trend that I'd like to speak a little bit about now because I believe this is really, truly where some of our future work needs to go. And I'll talk a little more about that at the end about why I see this as such an urgent need to address this part. So I spoke at that time about the whole issue of interpersonal adaptation and the importance of considering what's going on dyadically. And I began with a metaphor of two dancers swaying in perfect rhythm to the sensuous syncopation of a tango, their bodies in perfect harmony with the music and with one another as they dip and twirl and glide across the floor, each dancer's movement seeming to anticipate that of the partner, to respond to it and to mesh perfectly with it. And I suggested if we now think about how this applies to interpersonal communication, this notion of the coordination of people is really a touchstone of interpersonal communication, and one that we are, I think, uniquely positioned to understand. At the time, I suggested that although this metaphor may be oversimplified and idealized, it conjures up one of the great mysteries of human communication. How is it that we as humans are able to negotiate with such apparent ease what is in reality as highly complex and intricate an activity as interpersonal communication? Can we trace our capacity to coordinate and adapt our communication to one another to an inborn trait, to a selective talent passed on through the vagaries of genetic diversity, or to a proclivity acquired in the earliest weeks of life and honed through a lifetime of trial and error? How rooted in biology or sociology are the motivations to approach or avoid others? Does our physiology dictate our interpersonal communication patterns? Is the capacity to adapt and coordinate communication a constant linked to individual personality and communication style, or a variable amenable to intervention and modification? And how does it relate to the different trajectories that interpersonal interactions and personal relationships follow? And I suggested that such questions interpenetrate the very essence of the enterprise we call human communication and the capacities attributable to human communicators. So I suggested these are some of the key questions I think that motivate what we are studying interpersonal communication or ought to be considering. And clearly these are very complex questions that do not yield to simple answers. But it seems to me that these kinds of questions drive us to understand fundamentally how is it that we accomplish interpersonal communication. How do the constellation of verbal and nonverbal behaviors or messages that social actors express, how do those become merged with one another, coordinated with one another? How do we express the beliefs, the understandings, the expectations we have about our relationship? And I'm one that's keenly interested in the whole issue of relational communication. So how do these things get worked out? At the time we were making, in the interpersonal area, I think a strong plea for us to do more that was dyadic. And we all admitted at the time how challenging that was. Since that time, we have really seen a tremendous advance in the technologies that can aid those enterprises, ways in which we can not only code behavior, and some of this done automatically. For instance, in the the nonverbal communication division, we just gave an award for our top paper, and we, by the way, we cull these from the entire conference, so we look for anything that has a relevance to nonverbal communication. The top paper was on automating facial expression analysis. And there are many tools available, some of you have heard me speak about the ones that we are using, that enable us to measure things that were not measurable very easily in the past. At the same time, we've seen an explosion of new statistical tools and data mining tools that allow us to explore the patterns of interaction in ways that were really not possible before, and to explore patterns over time. So the dynamic interplay of what we really think of as interpersonal communication as this exchange process, and how does that get negotiated? What does it look like, and with what consequences over the course of time? In the work I'm doing now, I am finding that if there is one area where other disciplines feel at a loss, it is this understanding of the dynamics of interaction. And many times I find that they are encroaching on what we thought traditionally was our personal area of study. And so funding agencies, for example, will put out calls for research, and you find that they immediately label anything we do as psychology, and therefore it's supposed to be done by psychologists. Occasionally, some of the things that are more network-related, so larger group enterprises, they would see as a sociological responsibility. Now some of the analyses of behavior are being taken up by computer scientists, people who do computer vision work, for example, if we're talking about kinesics. And so I find that if there is one area where we still hold the trump cards, it is in understanding the dynamics of a dyadic relationship. So I'm enthused about the prospects of this work because there are many tools available, and yet I find we have not advanced very far in looking at these things. So I am projecting that if there is an area that is going to be particularly fruitful for future investigation, it will truly be in these areas of interaction, synchrony, interpersonal coordination, and the dynamics of behavior, moving away from these static or snapshot views to understanding long-term, longitudinal kinds of relationships. That can be across multiple episodes, or that can be even understanding within a single episode. We've just completed a project we're trying to analyze where we are collecting data at 30 frames per second. That's a challenge because it takes up so much space, first of all. But it allows you to look at such incredible nuances and where are behaviors co-occurring. And there is a tool, for example, an analysis tool called Theme, developed by a man in Iceland, Magnus Magnusson, that allows you to look at events. You don't have to even look at it as a time series, but you can look at hidden patterns in behavior. So you can see that person A does this, person B does this. It doesn't have to be contiguous. Person A comes back and does this, and you'll see these recurrent patterns. And they will show up repeatedly in the interaction, and you start to see the way in which our behavior is highly patterned. So these are some of the issues I think we should be addressing in the future. They are challenging, they are complicated, but I think we are up to the task.
I'm going to stand up there so I can see. Good afternoon. I hope it's afternoon. Good morning. I'm Sandra Petronio. When I was asked to do this presentation, I immediately thought of talking about communication privacy management theory, of course. However, I wanted to do something a little different, and I know that Dr. Berger is going to also talk about some of the historical issues. But what I would like to present to you is something I did a number of years ago. There has never been published, but not because I didn't try to publish it, but I want to present this to you today because I think it's very important to have historical roots of our discipline, and especially in interpersonal communication. So really one of the ways to better understand the direction for future is really to study what happened in the past. So a number of years ago, I did a systematic thematic analysis of the very early speech and communication journals starting from 1915 to trace the grounding ideas, because if you believe that there are themes that exist long before you put it together and discover something, that's what this is. So I tried to see what are those themes. How could we find our historical roots from 1915? And it serves as then the basis for the growth and development of, and did serve as the basis of the growth and development for interpersonal communication as a legitimate area of inquiry. Now, unlike other areas of our field, the history of interpersonal communication hasn't really been on the forefront of a lot of discussions. There are some that exist, but not a lot. Although our field is born out of two traditions that define our discipline, the rhetoric and scientific, the scientific approach carries the weight of influence for interpersonal communication, largely within our scholarship. 7 areas contributed to the evolution of what we now call interpersonal communication. These dominant themes are found before 1970 from 1915. The time frame was used to establish a solid grasp on this historical roots of interpersonal communication. The themes forming the historical basis for our area of the discipline include, first, the scientific examination of public speaking, the scientific research on persuasion, the speech psychology, the scientific study of audience reactions, scientific investigations of attitudes and attitude change, the scientific research on source credibility or ethos, and the last is the study on message systems. In 1915, we find the research committee of the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking advised that scholars should embark on, quote, scientific investigations of public speaking to better understand issues such as gestures, mental processes of individuals, the way perceptions, images, ideas, thoughts, feelings determine the speaking experience and the meaning of communicating with and among people. In conjunction with this call, articles were published early in the 1900s advocating a conceptual focus that lent itself to scientific inquiry. As such, scholars were formulating refinements of ways they conceptualized public speaking as arguing that, quote, expression was the viable form of communication. The likes of Wolbert in 1915 and Gaylord in 1916 pointed out that the purpose of studying oral expression was to give people an understanding of living speech. That is, living speech that was adequate for ordinary intercourse and capable of expressing thoughts and emotions of men and women as they conduct their relationships. In 1917, people like C.M. Newcomb published an article in the Quarterly Journal of Public Speaking suggesting that expression is the mode of self-realization. Self-expression in everyday life, therefore, was considered an important concern of these early scholars in our field and established a link between speaking as expression of oneself that could lead to not only self-realization, but establish relationships with other people. From the expression movement, with an emphasis on empirical research, we find the first emergent theme, scientific examination of public speaking. 3 central issues mark the future trends found in interpersonal communication. First, although other factors contributed to the development of nonverbal communication, perhaps you might consider the elocutionists, for example, some of the early research on expression emphasized communicative elements of facial and body movement in addition to verbal utterances. Second, oral expression as a particular emphasis was instrumental in piquing interest in relational and person-to-person interactions in everyday life among these early scholars. Third, the weight given to the significance of the individual as the person interacting as opposed to one-to-many, but people-to-people, that was found in the early research on public speaking in these particular scholars' research, really help us think about the beginning emerging ideas of interpersonal communication. To date, the second theme, the scientific research on persuasion, has the longest duration of interest in interpersonal communication, in emphasizing a core assumption that frames the current study of interpersonal communication. Wolbert in 1919 cautioned that studying persuasion should take into account the motives of and emotions of individuals and attitudes of the hearer. Though we've witnessed an evolution of persuasion research that includes branches to compliance gaining and social influence, the topic remains really a mainstay since the 19-teens in our field. The early 1900s, we find the beginning of the third theme, the psychology of speech, and has played an intermittent yet significant role in our history in interpersonal communication. There were early attempts to use psychological theories to explain speech. The speech considered is largely interpersonal interactions between individuals. For example, Gray, in 1928, he has an article that assesses the impact of Gestalt psychology on the way that people speak to each other. His article on behavioristic interpretations of language in 1935 also is important because it frames the way behaviorism plays a role in the speech act. Of course, today we see the blending of research and theory around the common themes of relating, where scholars draw from not only psychology, but also many other fields of inquiry. Yet this early foray into judging the utility of research in other disciplines, like psychology, really was important in opening doors to being receptive to interdisciplinary research. Although the focus on the audience was not a new concept early in our discipline, the move to conduct empirical research on the topic of audience reaction is the fourth theme, provided a new dimension to the existing scholarship at the time. Milson in 1932 advocates studying, quote, attitudes as expressed in opinion. Milson notes that the, quote, most serviceable technique for studying opinion change in the audience in a life situation was developed by H.S. Woodward, a teacher of speech. Woodward, 1928, studied the opinion change and shifts in attitude during speaking situations, using what he called the ballot technique to register opinions before and after the speech. The shift of opinion ballot, which it became known as, was first suggested by Otterbeck in 1922 and later developed as a research instrument by Woodward in 1928. This shift of opinion ballot resembles the Likert scale, but predates Likert by at least 4 to 5 years. And some argue that it was really the basis of the Likert scale. And even if you look at early citations of Likert, he cites Otterbeck and Woodward. The fifth scientific investigation of attitudes began to appear in the journals around 1930s. There was a concentrated effort on measurement to determine the influence of perceptions. For example, Frank Lindor's, for which we have an award named after, study on speech attitudes. The jump was short from considering changes in speech attitudes to those that are found in small group communication and interpersonal interactions. This area of emphasis was routinely found in journals in the 1960s, as you probably well know. The sixth theme is that scientific research on source credibility, or ethos, has played an important role in framing some of the current trends in interpersonal communication that we see. Although this area only began to appear in the 1940s, its proliferation after that date was significant to the study of interpersonal communication as we know it today. Many may consider the idea of source credibility mostly pertinent to public speaking. However, several of the early scholars understood the importance to personal relationships. For example, early researchers argued that believing in individuals or the trust in their credibility had an impact on their perceptions and the ability to persuade and deceive. Seventh theme, the last theme, studies in message systems in the is the last, framing interpersonal. In the early 1960s, articles began to appear that reflected a growing emphasis on speech patterns, sentence structures, messages as focus. Issues such as the effects of anxiety-arousing messages related to immediate recall of messages, differences between the familiar and the impersonal reference, and the verbal behavior in dyads were examined. These articles may be seen as early expeditions into information processing, discourse, conversational analysis, and investigating the speech acts, all of which are relevant to us today. So as these themes portray the very, very early history of interpersonal communication, carved out areas that positioned scientific research at the center and shifted the scope of public speaking to person-to-person interactions. However, it really wasn't until 1948 that Frank Rehrig contended the next advancements in 1948 in the study of speech was the focus on, quote, inter-personal relationships. Nevertheless, the term was not widely used until the 70s. The interpersonal communication became a legitimate area of study. There were a number of articles outlining the nature of the topic. For example, Gerald Miller in 1975 posited a conceptualization that distinguished between non-interpersonal and interpersonal. But fundamentally, it is through the discussions such as the ones Professor Miller advanced that we see the beginning prominence of personal relationships and the associated communicative routines found among individuals in those relationships. Finally, we have grown from not only a scientific research perspective, but theory as well. And after the 70s, we witnessed the development of theoretical development, like Charles Berger's uncertainty theory, that offer guideposts so we can use to better grasp the way that people communicate with people. And I'm hoping that you will also see that communication privacy management adds to that theoretical trend and also set some future goals for us to consider taking. Thank you very much.
Hi. This panel offers us a great opportunity to reflect on our history, evaluate our accomplishments, and put forth some goals for the future. Given that my esteemed colleagues on this panel have made some of the foundational contributions to the field of interpersonal communication, they're probably more well-equipped than I am to provide an historical perspective and to critique the extant research and theory in the area. So what I'd like to do this morning is to take this opportunity to first briefly laud the theoretical and empirical work we've done in recent years, and then make several recommendations about what we might do to enhance the quality of our work in the future. So let me first take a couple of minutes to praise where we are and what we've accomplished. I think we can point to several pieces of evidence supporting the idea that interpersonal communication as an area is no longer in its infancy and that we're producing important, high-quality work. For example, one interesting piece of evidence comes from comparing articles that we published 3 decades ago to those that we're publishing today. One thing that I try to always have my graduate students who are going through comprehensive exams do is to go back to the early issues of HCR, read those articles, and then read the articles that are being published today in HCR, in current issues. And what they generally see is that articles published today have stronger, more sophisticated theoretical rationales in many cases. Articles published today include questions that are more complex, so they involve more than the correlations between several variables. Articles published today often involve more than a single study, so they're taking questions that are initially posited further and in some cases making bigger contributions to the literature. Another piece of evidence that I think we can point to supporting our maturity is that we have handbooks now. Handbook of Communication Science, the 2nd edition recently came out, hot off the press, buy it now. Handbook of Interpersonal Communication, I think is going on its 4th edition now. And these handbooks provide thorough, sophisticated reviews of the content of our studies. So, in other words, we do have a content. We have a large body of research now and findings that we can bring to the table of any discussion concerning interpersonal communication and human behavior. A third piece of evidence supporting our maturity as a field is that many of us now are doing interdisciplinary work. We're collaborating with researchers from other fields and bringing the research and theory to the table that those people haven't considered before, and I think that's evident in some of what Judy was talking about this morning. In fact, we also have more professors now who will join appointments in other departments like business, psychology, engineering, because people in those departments see what we do as useful and as important. So all of these things and other things as well are evidence of the intellectual maturity that many people in our field are bringing to their work, and these things are worth acknowledging. With this said, I think it's also important to evaluate where we are and to set goals for where we want to be in the future. So I'd like to make 5 recommendations about what we might do to enhance the quality of our work in the future. First thing I think we need to do is reevaluate our perspective on our own prowess as researchers. I've been coming to NCA conventions for quite a few years now, and every couple years I see a panel on which interpersonal communication scholars get up and discuss the dismal quality of our research and the lack of theory in our work. Again, I believe that evaluating the quality of our work is incredibly important, but I'd like to respectfully argue that we're negatively biased about our own research. In fact, when it comes to evaluating the status of theory in our field, I think we've developed and that we continue to nurture a low professional self-esteem. Most of people in this room are aware of the literature on self-esteem and what individuals with self-esteem, that are low self-esteem, tend to do. The research on people with low self-esteem suggests that people with low self-esteem focus on their negative qualities over their positive qualities. They tend to be more easily threatened than people with high self-esteem, and they often assume that other people are better than they are. I think in many cases we do all of those things. We note that we lack theoretical presence and that many of our studies are theoretically or methodologically bankrupt. We constantly bemoan the fact that we borrow theories from social psychology, and we imply, if not argue, that people in other fields do better research than we do. Part of the problem with engaging in behaviors like these is that they set us up for failure. They do so by encouraging us to engage in behaviors that undermine the quality of our work, and they also do so by presenting our work to other people in a negative light. And that's not a good way to promote our research within the field to other researchers, to researchers in other fields, and importantly, to administrators who currently hold the purse strings to our departments in these lean economic times. A second recommendation I'd like to make for the future is that we continue asking interesting questions in our research. Our research addresses issues that people, both lay people and researchers in other fields, want to know about. In fact, our research generates information that people need. Many of us became interested in this field because it's practical, because we believe that communication affects people's lives in very fundamental ways, and that as a consequence, the questions we ask in our research also can affect people's lives in very fundamental ways. If we continue asking useful, interesting questions, we'll generate useful, interesting research, and importantly, other people will read and cite our work. The third recommendation I'd like to make is that we do our best to refrain from being seduced by statistical fads. All fields do this to some extent, and we are no different. In the late 1980s, it was log linear analysis. In the 1990s, it was hierarchical linear modeling, and today it's structural equation modeling. Certainly, all of these statistical techniques have their strengths. They enable us to ask questions that we couldn't ask before, and that's really important, obviously. But we need to refrain from using them as hammers with which to hit every single piece of data in our line of sight. And we also need to remember the importance of parsimony. We don't want to favor parsimony over precision, and some of these new statistical techniques allow us a great deal of precision that we didn't have before. But I think it's also important to remember the importance every once in a while of the idea that sometimes a clear, elegant 2x2 ANOVA is the best way to address a question. My fourth recommendation is that we build on existing literature rather than we reinvent the wheel. Some people in the field seem to think that the best way to establish a name for themselves or a niche for their research is to develop a new theory. In many cases, they are correct. Generating and articulating and testing theory is an incredibly important function of what we do. However, a close examination of some of these new theories reveals that they're not altogether new. Instead, they represent a new twist on an old theory with a new name added. Rather than continue to generate theories that are derivative of old theories with new names, I would like us to see us simply apply and use the old theory and clearly articulate the ways in which examining communication requires that the theory be modified or updated. Doing this would draw the attention of researchers from other fields who are familiar with the old theories, and importantly, it would also highlight the contributions that communication researchers can make to updating or improving those theories. It would, in other words, put us in the position of building on existing literature rather than reinventing the wheel. My fifth and final recommendation is related to the fourth one. We need to remember that the best idea is not necessarily a new idea, or at least it's not a completely brand new idea. This is going to make me sound really old, but I often lament the fact that our students frequently fail to go back and read the theoretical work of their academic predecessors. How many times do you hear someone use and talk about cognitive dissonance theory without ever having read Festinger's work? Or closer to home, how many times do you hear students talk about uncertainty reduction theory without doing a thorough review of Berger and Calabresi? That would be 1975 HCR for those of you that haven't read that one. I challenge some of the younger people in the audience to go back and read Goffman's book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. It is full of interesting ideas and potential hypotheses. These are old, classic pieces of literature. There are many of them out there. And if you go back and read them, you'll be amazed at what some of them have to say to what the work that we're doing today. My point here is not to sound like a grouchy old professor, nor is it to squelch innovation, because clearly a very important part of what we do is come up with new ideas and innovate. But instead, I'd like to note that the literature is not as void of a theory and ideas as we sometimes think it is. Scholars have been trying to explain human communication for decades. In fact, some people would say scholars have been trying to explain human communication for centuries. The ideas that those people have put forth are readily available for us to draw upon. One way we might revitalize our current theories is to go back and look at the work of those who've come before us. So in closing, I'd like to praise the theoretical and empirical work we've done in the past 3 or 4 decades, but I'd also like to argue that if we rethink our theoretical prowess as researchers, continue to ask interesting questions, avoid statistical fashion trends, build on extant research, and look more closely at the theoretical ideas of those researchers that came before us, we'd be in better shape 5 years from now when we gather again to evaluate the state of research and theory in interpersonal and relational communication. Thank you.
Well, as the perpetrator of an old theory, even I can't go back to 1916, as did Sandra, and so my remarks about the history will be confined to a lived history, and because that's the case, I can't possibly go back that far. So you'll have to forgive me, and I think I have a slightly different slant than Sandra did, so I don't think it's completely redundant, repetitious, and also repeating itself. And darn, I was really listed on the program before Sandra, so never mind. That doesn't matter. Okay, it's truly an honor to be on a panel with the likes of Judy Burgoon, Sandra Petronio, Anita Evangelisti, and Brant Burleson there in the he's really there, but you don't see him. All these researchers have made outstanding and valuable and sustained and continuing contributions to the study of interpersonal communication. They have had a major influence on the evolution of the interpersonal communication area, an enterprise that began to gain prominence in the communication science realm during the late 1950s and early 1960s, as I think really Sandra sort of alluded to. As many of you are well aware, the earliest roots of pre-World War II communication science were anchored in the study of mass media effects, a tradition established primarily by such figures as sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld, political scientist Harold Lasswell, and the members of the Chicago School of Sociology. In addition to Lazarsfeld and Lasswell, Wilbur Schramm, a prominent figure in the development of post-World War II communication science, also designated psychologists Carl Hovland and Kurt Levine as the founders of the communication field. Hovland is best known for his studies of communication and persuasion at Yale University, a research program that continued into the beginning of the 1960s. Levine is best known for his studies of social influence in groups and his oft-quoted dictum that nothing is as practical as a good theory, which is, I think, many of us would do well to remember today. It is these two latter figures, Levine and Hovland, who had a highly significant impact on early interpersonal communication researchers trained in speech departments during the late 1950s. Jerry Miller, Bob Bostrom, John Bowers, Ken Serino, Fred Williams, and others are among the members of the first interpersonal communication cohort, which I'm thinking here. Inspired by Fessinger's theory of cognitive dissonance, in collaboration with several different graduate students, Jerry Miller launched a program of research aimed at understanding the effects of counter-attitudinal advocacy on those producing persuasive messages. Bostrom also published work in this area. Other interpersonal communication researchers of that era examined the influence of such variables as source credibility, message-sidedness, fear appeals, and others deemed by the Yale group to be important to the success of persuasion attempts. Still other researchers, following in the Levine tradition, examined social influence in groups. And if you can imagine browsing through the 1960s convention programs of the then Speech Association of America, SAA, looking for interpersonal communication programs, you would happen upon many programs that included experimental studies of attitude change and social influence in groups. That was they were the dominant kinds of studies that appeared in those programs in that period. However, there were exceptions to this general rule. For example, in an early study done in the then nascent nonverbal communication area, Miller and Hugill, 1964, reported that audience members' competence and dynamism judgments of speakers' credibility tended to suffer with increasing speech disfluencies, but trustworthiness judgments did not. Findings at Burgoon, Bierk, and Fowl, 1990, partially replicated some 26 years later. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the face of interpersonal communication changed dramatically. At least three converging vectors in interpersonal communications disciplinary space can be identified to account for the drift away from the two fundamental areas of experimental studies of attitude change and social influence in groups. First, the social upheaval in the middle and late 1960s, part of which featured admonitions to turn away from the manipulation of others and embrace, quote, authentic communication, a theme that fueled the rise of the T-group and counter-group movement, increasingly cast a pall over attitude change research, which was seen as a tool for manipulating others. Second, the cry for, quote, authentic communication prompted the study of self-disclosure as represented in the early work of Sidney Girard, clinical psychologist. Echoes of these two influences can be seen in Sandra's work on privacy management and Brant Burleson's comforting research, although providing social support may sometimes just be another way of saying persuasion. Third, Altman and Taylor's 1973 book, Social Penetration, The Development of Interpersonal Relationships, as well as Don Byrne's extensive research program on interpersonal attraction and his 1971 book, The Attraction Paradigm, sparked intense interest in the role communication plays in the development, maintenance, and decay of relationships. Miller and Steinberg's 1975 book, Between People, and Mark Knapp's 1978 volume, Social Intercourse, From Greeting to Goodbye, and its later incarnations with Anita as the co-author, consolidated the relationship development paradigm within interpersonal communication. Curiously, even though group communication researchers routinely invoke such theoretical constructs as group cohesion, socio-emotional communication during the 1960s and 50s, actually, this area and the constructs it embodied did not become a touchstone for relationship development researchers. At the same time as the relationship development juggernaut began to gain momentum during the middle and late 1970s, there was an exceedingly important development that implicated interpersonal communication. This development concerned discussions of the paucity of original theorizing in the communication field. The central figures in these debates did not come from mass communication, but rather they were individually primarily interested in interpersonal communication. These debates and dialogues about theory construction began to bear fruit with the development of such theoretical frameworks as the Coordinated Management of Meaning, URT, and were closely followed by Judy's EVT. In addition, constructivism exerted a strong push in the direction of theory development during that period, 1970s. These early efforts led to a cascade of interpersonal communication theories developed by communication scientists. Of paramount importance, however, is the fact that among the many and varied duchies that dot the current communication science landscape, it would be hardly an exercise in hyperbole to assert that interpersonal communication research is more frequently motivated by original theories and models than is research done in any other area of the field. So you shouldn't. It was a nice therapeutic moment, but I don't have low self-esteem. Thank you. Although numerically much larger and with a history that stretches back to the pre-World War II era, the mass communication effects enterprise still has remarkably few well-developed theories to guide its inquiries. Moreover, some media effects perspectives labeled theories, such as cultivation and agenda setting, are more like simple bivariate hypotheses than theories. As Robin Nabby and Mary Beth Oliver have observed in the Media Effects chapter in the second edition of the Handbook of Communication Science. Interestingly, media and politics researchers are beginning to take seriously the role that conversations about public policy and politics play in the processing of information obtained from the media. They have become uncomfortable using anemic interpersonal communication measures consisting of a few survey items that ask respondents how many times they have talked with others about political topics. In fact, they have gone so far as to videotape and analyze political discussions. I think they need our help. Although attitude change and group processes are topics that have all but vanished from the contemporary interpersonal communication research scene, they are alive and well in the larger communication science community. In fact, the second edition of the Handbook of Comm Science includes chapters on persuasion by Jim Dillard, compliance gaining, Steve Wilson, social influence in groups and organizations, Siebold, Myers, and Shoham, group decision making, Poole and Dobosh, interpersonal conflict, Al Sillers, intergroup conflict, Don Ellis, bargaining negotiation, Roloff and Lee. These chapters reflect extensions and elaborations of the two founding areas sketched earlier. The handbook also features chapters on language, Solich and Giles, nonverbal communication, Burgoon, Floyd, and Guerrero, emotion, Plan Out, Metz, and Tracy, establishing and maintaining relationships, Solomon, Evangelisti, and marital and family communication, Kerner, all of which represent later developed research areas. As macroeconomic modelers have repeatedly found, it is extremely hazardous to predict the future course of complex economic systems. So it is with intellectual enterprises. I doubt very seriously that Jerry Miller could have foreseen the rise of the relationship development phoenix from his middle 1960s counter-attitudinal advocacy vantage point. Nevertheless, there are slow but relentless structural changes occurring at the global level that are bound to impact the conduct and study of interpersonal communication. First, our experience of the world, including the people in it, is rapidly becoming digitized and mediated. FTF may become an endangered species, although at this point it is probably not necessary to include it in the Endangered Species Act. Second, this trend toward mediated social interaction could be further accelerated by decreased physical mobility resulting from increased transportation costs driven by decreases in worldwide supplies of oil. Of course, this latter development might be slowed by some dramatic technological breakthrough, but while it is not very difficult to imagine a world populated by electric and hydrogen cell cars, electric aircraft capable of carrying hundreds of passengers 6 miles above the Earth at 600 miles an hour is another story. So in the spirit of our latest methodological fad, HLM, students of interpersonal communication would be wise to keep an eye on these global developments, lest they lose sight of the proverbial forest by focusing on its individual trees. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of time for some good interaction. So, questions? Don't be shy.
It's a demonstration academic efficiency principle. People spend their lifetime studying things.
Well, I'll start with the first question. What do you think about the emphasis on grants and where we're going with our research and the challenges that we face? Or anything you'd like to speak about?
Judy, go.
Judy can talk about grants.
I'm not entirely sure that there is a uniform emphasis on grants, but I can't speak really to that in other places because where I am, it is important. I think part of the pressures come from the fact that many universities now are funded more and more by external funding. We've been having these discussions that so many institutions are down to 10% or less of their funding from their state sources. What that does, I think, is place a real premium on grant development because you are in a unit that is going to survive if there are funds coming in from grants. So I'd say some of the external pressures are really there to acquire more resources. In many ways, obtaining grants can be very useful because you have the opportunity to do some things you could not possibly do without the funding. You may be able to have equipment, you may be able to pay subjects, you also get the external validation from external in the sense of your unit being validated within the larger university community, and the university in turn really likes being able to point to that. There is a risk in that I think now it is so competitive for the small pool of money that one can invest a tremendous amount of time writing proposals that have very low probability of succeeding just because of the competitiveness. We're also at a major disadvantage in our field in that we do not have directorates in, for example, National Science Foundation that are specifically targeted to communication. So we have to go sort of hat in hand to, say, social psychology or computers and information systems and engineering to try to demonstrate that we are relevant. And often, I'll just give one of my experiences long ago, going to an education agency, they wanted to know, when I called the program officer to see if something we were doing might be relevant, they wanted to know how many things we had already published in the education journals and how many people we had on the grant with an education degree and whether we had a history of funding in that area. So it was a short, sweet conversation that terminated that route. So I think, we decided that had almost no probability of success. But I, for one, have found that our research has been able to advance dramatically by virtue of having extramural funding. So I think for research-intensive universities, it's a given. That's why you are there. You're expected to generate the knowledge that we're going to disseminate in our classes and to the community at large, to society. And having the extramural funding can significantly advance that effort. Others?
I think one of the things that is important that has begun, but it's very new, is that the national office, NCA, has gone around to try to introduce the funding agencies to the kind of work that we do in communication and get them to reframe and have the extension of incorporation of the communication discipline. Now, that's an enormously important move, but it's very new, and we all have to try to help them do that and do that in a better way than they have in the past. And so, I think that those are important steps, but very new.
I'd like to add one more thing that just as we're thinking about this, the concept of us being more interdisciplinary. We've always been viewed potentially as just at the intersection of a lot of other disciplines. So there's always a risk of losing some identity. But I do think it's extremely valuable now with all the push to do collaborative work and interdisciplinary work, and this is coming out of the agencies. They're beginning to recognize just how valuable the communication component is. And people, for instance, from engineering may be coming and knocking on the doors of people who have communication background. That can be extraordinarily stimulating. So I think that is one of the positives of this push to get extramural funding.
And thank you all, because I can't wait to show this to my grad class. My grad class actually talks about all these things. We spend a lot of time on the history and theory and really backtrack. And I feel it's important to have them kind of get the roots and the foundation first before anything else. But one of the difficulties I've had is that I make them choose a position and how do you define interpersonal and that kind of thing. And they really had a hard time with the self-esteem issue and if you all don't know what you are and that kind of thing. And I think that as interpersonal scholars, I think we have a very clear understanding of where we fit and where we are. But when you're trying to teach that to people who don't have that background, my question, I guess, then is, how do you give them the history, plus the self-esteem, plus a clear understanding of what we are? And I'm having a difficult time with that.
Well, there's some really good chapters in the. I come at it looking at it from the point of view of communication science, which is a little bit different history than other histories. Okay, but there's certainly, if you, depending on your perspective, there's certainly some really good histories that, including in the two handbooks, the first and second edition, ideally. Now, it's interesting. The first, Jesse Delia, who is identified as I think everybody would identify as an interpersonal scholar, wrote a history of communication science, which primarily had to do with mass communication, and as I said here, that's the early history. Now, it isn't. If you listen to Sanders' version, it's a different version, right? It's interesting, okay, but I think if students, follow that along, and then of course we have another sort of update of that history chapter in the second edition of this handbook. Okay, so I think if students read this, I think they should have a pretty good idea of, maybe somebody should write in some handbook somewhere a history chapter that's devoted only to, and you could maybe sort of try to integrate these two perspectives.
Well, I think that one of the difficulties that we have is, and it's a good thing that happened, but it's still something that makes the parameter setting a little more difficult, and that is really interpersonal communication was the birthplace of family communication, health communication, and so you start to see that the basic principles of interpersonal communication get applied contextually, and so students, I think, have a hard time to say, okay, so what's left? And instead of saying that this is where the birthplace of these contextual applications of these same principles have been applied, and that we do focus a lot of our energy on personal relationship issues, but not exclusively, because a lot of the cognitive stuff really goes across the board. So I think it's our responsibility not to draw the parameter line so tightly, because they don't belong that way, and that's one of the beauties of interpersonal communication. It birthed these great things.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce that, because I can tell you, I did live through this, and there's several other people in this room who did. Prior to, say, 1976, I would say there was no such thing as health communication. It was interpersonal. Part of it was interpersonal, and if people wanted to do papers on campaign effects, they did them in mass communication. Now, if you're going to segment a field, and I think this is an intellectual mistake, I think it's absolutely been, in a certain sense, catastrophic. If you're going to, I don't believe that there's a strong rationale for the divisions that we have. I'm thinking of ICA. At some level, there may be a rationale for some divisions, but the proliferation is I don't think you can justify it, and that's an example. I know why health communication moved out. I was there. I saw it. Okay, they were dissatisfied. They didn't think they were respected, and there's always a political kind of dimension. Okay. So people were doing the work were dismayed, and so and now, of course, it becomes a freestanding. I'm a critic of health communication at all. I'm just saying this is what happened. This is the way it happened, and I think this is happening. You can cite many other instances of that. So we get this proliferation, and so then the core. Sandra's right. Then the core divisions, suffer. In a certain sense, because you say, well, that's health. I'm a health communication researcher now. That's my identity. Yeah, but you're studying social interaction, aren't you? Okay, doctor-patient interaction. So, what are you telling me? It's a context.
Well, and the language and social interaction division was the same kind of, again, splintering off. The nonverbal communication division is we all identify ourselves also as interpersonal people or LSI people. Social cognition group came out of that. If I could just add one thought here, if we think about where we're going forward, I have shared the concern about this continued splintering of divisions and organizing ourselves by context. I've never felt context was the right way to go, but I wasn't there when the blueprint was laid out. And I think the more we can push our scholarship in the interpersonal area toward the kinds of functions we serve, and that's my personal bias, but understanding the things that have to do with just the basics of social interaction, looking at the impact on close relationships, looking at emotional expression, and so on, that one can divide what we do, relational communication, social influence, etc., we can understand what we do in a more cross-disciplinary way and interdisciplinary way. I think that's where we start to have value added, significant value added to what other fields are doing. And maybe we need to start at home. When we talk about being interdisciplinary, maybe we need to better clarify how much all these other people have interpersonal as their foundation.
I would just add that the disaster of the sort of balkanization of this discipline is that it absolutely discourages people from theorizing at the level of process, fundamental processes, the fundamental processes of communication, the fundamental processes of social interaction, because they're so preoccupied with context, and that harbors the belief that this context is so unique that one cannot have general principles that transcend contexts. And I believe you can have at a certain level. I think context may modulate these principles, but I believe you can have transcendent principles that render the context irrelevant. Okay, but if you insist on thinking that way, then I guess you insist on thinking that way.
I have a very practical kind of question about the growth of interpersonal. Remembering my own graduate school days, those wars between rhetoricians and communication scientists were very brutal. In that process of the communication sciences emerging, rhetoricians were seen pretty much as like old school, second-class citizens who really didn't really know where the sciences were really leading. And at that point where that was sort of happening between the Michigan State perspectives, the Big Ten schools who were kind of pushing the sciences, the basic course in speech comm was changing from traditional public speaking courses to the hybrid course to bring in interpersonal small group work into that class. And in some institutions, even interpersonal became sort of that primary introductory basic course. But I would say as the field has continued to grow, there's almost like a reversal now where I'm at a liberal arts university. We have about 600 majors, so comm's the largest major. But I would say when we look at other institutions, to go back to our basic courses, what we're doing, it appears that public speaking is reemerging as the basic introductory course for the field of communication studies. In some ways, it doesn't make sense to me with the growth of what we've learned about interpersonal, but I wonder if we no longer see interpersonal as a skills-related activity, and that's why colleges and universities are reducing the place of interpersonal in the curriculum, and therefore, as a teachable subject, except for upper-level courses and research design, research programs, but not something we bring to intro students. So I guess I'd like your perspective on that, because you've all been present during a lot of that as well.
At Davis, we have two lower division classes, one in public speaking, traditional public speaking, and one in interpersonal skill. So we do both. I mean, that's our deal.
I think part of the pause you're hearing up here is that I'm not sure we'd all say it's a uniform thing that everybody's scaling back just to public speaking. But there's certainly the issue of there's a demand out there from business schools and schools of engineering and those sorts of places for public speaking, and that we need to make sure that demand is still in place for interpersonal as well.
I've had the opportunity in the past semester to work with some sociologists, and it's been a really great conversation. We have these great brainstorming sessions, and then when we talk about how our perspectives can inform each other to study behaviors, they always want to go back and use the national data set to test these ideas that we come up with. So we'll dig into the data a little bit, and it's or they'll tell me there's communication variables in there. And when we go and look at the items, they're not exactly what I had in mind. So I was curious as to what your thoughts were for using national data sets in our research, if we could move in a direction where we could be better represented in those data sets, but also if there are negative components to maybe representing interpersonal data in these massive data sets that are out there. So I was just wondering what your perspectives were on that, and if that would maybe give us some opportunity to be interdisciplinary in these conversations, or what's the downsides.
I'd like to comment on that, and I'll pass on the microphone. First of all, what you're talking about with those national data sets is survey data, right? I have felt for a long time that survey data is a very inadequate way of tapping into communication. I'm very strong on looking at the actual behavior, looking at actual interactions. I do think we can build our own corpora that can be analyzed by a lot of different people. We're doing some of that in our own research, trying to annotate massive sets of interactions, small group interactions, dyadic interactions under different circumstances. And those kind of corpora at least have real people interacting with one another. The use of just survey data is really going to stunt our growth and our contributions, because other people can create survey questions and say, well, this is just part of our own sociological work.
Can I comment on something before I leave? I'd like to comment on the proliferation notion. I just retired from U.S. Department of Education for 21 years on education policy research. And every time I tried to bring in my field of communication, it kind of was not seen as the discipline, and I think that it's because of a lot of the proliferation, and people think they invented communication field and communication research. But having said that, I'd like to go back to the fact that my dissertation and graduate work was at Penn State in the 60s and was heavily grounded in the emerging field of interpersonal communication, cognitive dissonance, and many other things that were emerging. When I went to the University of Nebraska, I was given the task of directing the Teacher Corps program, which were liberal arts majors who were trying to learn to teach on Indian reservations, inner cities, many things we still grapple with. I didn't know where to start. I observed what the difficulties were in their learning to reach parents and culture and students. And I grounded everything I did in my communication discipline. Everything I taught them about how to reach those students, how to translate mathematics concepts, history concepts, was grounded in communication, because that's what teaching is. When I went to, and it was successful, and we developed models out of that, which were grounded in interpersonal communication, which are in Eric somewhere. When I went to the Department of Communication and I saw how lacking we were in being recognized as a discipline and field, and at no time is it more apparent than right now, where No Child Left Behind is being reauthorized in the elementary and secondary math. There's grappling with how to prepare teachers to reach the same kind of populations I was talking about in the 60s. And the preparation will consist of writing skills for teachers, primarily, and reading skills. And nowhere in there is there anything about communication from the perspective that we understand it. And so for years, when I was in the national office of what was SAA and then SCA, I tried to get us to really get political from that point of view and lobby for inclusion in this kind of legislation. And I think rather than proliferate all these different contexts that you're talking about as a field, what we have to do is use what we have and adapt it to the different problems that society is facing. And one of them is teaching and learning, and I want to make that clear.
Your thoughts?
Well, one of the issues that I hear embedded in the discussion that you just had with us is the move toward doing research that has to do with translational work. And I think that that's important, and I think a lot of people already do that in the communication field. They really do practice work toward developing practice, interventions, ways of understanding, making things better for people. But I think that we need to ratchet that up. I think we need to go outside the discipline and illustrate and utilize and apply whatever we have to different problems in ways that are very meaningful. Personally, I'd skip the identity. I wouldn't worry about that.
Well, I'm going to chime in just a little bit. I think what's kind of interesting about how this whole discussion has gone is we're kind of dancing around some very similar issues, which is the fragmentation of the field, and then where's our identity, and how do you go out with this identity and deal with interdisciplinary work. I think part of what Sandra just said is right on target. If we stop looking at our tummy buttons a little bit and our identity and go out and do some really great work, it's going to take care of itself. And really realizing that we have done some of that great work and that what we have to offer that other fields don't. So I was thinking of your question up here. When we look at recent theories like Sandra's theory and say, okay, that part of that emerged out of social penetration theory, and have your students go back and say, what does Sandra's theory do that's completely different and new that social penetration theory didn't do? And when they do that kind of tracing, they see there's so much that communication has to offer that other fields don't have. We can't walk into those interdisciplinary meetings worrying about our identity. We've got to go into those interdisciplinary meetings and say, here's what we have to offer you in this project. The same thing with when you brought up the survey data question that I think is absolutely relevant. What do we have to offer to those survey data folks that they haven't looked at before? And certainly what Judy said is very well taken. No, they're not going to be looking at social interaction, and they're just not. But are there things that we can say to them and questions that we can include in those questionnaires, those big, large surveys that would give us some added value in terms of PR for our own field and show them things that they haven't been considering before? And I think really clearly the answer to that is absolutely yes. And once you go into those meetings and talk to those folks, we're doing it at UT, there's a lot of folks, for example, in nursing that are really interested in communication, and they don't know the questions to ask. They're not going to look at it in our kind of favorite optimal ways that we would like them to, but we can give them some input and then open up a whole new world for them that they wouldn't look at before. And I think once we start doing that sort of thing, it eliminates the identity thing and moves us so much forward in terms of our own public relations for our own field.
I think people in other fields are very hungry for what we have to offer, Absolutely. But they don't know what it is until you get there. And you say, I do all this stuff in the medical school. And I go and they present all these problems. Everything about communication is an ethics issue. And so, I have to reframe for them what this really looks like in a different context or a different idea. And they're just stunned. They have no clue that they didn't, they said, oh, there's a whole discipline of this? So, yeah.
But you can even, depending on how you define your discipline, we hired two people from political communication people from the Journalism Mass Communication, University of Wisconsin. All right? They're very interested in how people process political content from the media. But upon arriving at Davis, they immediately started asking me and other people, well, how do we study discussion? How do you guys study discussion? Now, these people are communication researchers just as you are, okay? They're in your field. You don't have to go to far afield at all to find these people. They are in your field right now, and they need your help. It's interesting how the examples usually are things that are far, and that's my experience. They're saying, well, how do I do it? I'm going to videotape interactions where people are going to talk about politics, what they saw on television, during a political campaign. What do I do with it? Okay? And then you have to sit down and you have to teach them. I mean, that's what you're doing.
Well, and I think that the other thing that Chuck just brought up that also kind of ties some of this together is most of us who are starting to reach out and try to do the grant getting thing, because a lot of us are getting that pressure, found that our infrastructure for grants is absolutely dismal compared to other fields. I mean, it is. It is worse than pathetic. If you go to other places like medical schools, they say, I got this great idea, and then they have an office administrator person who writes half of it for them. So they don't have to spend 9 months doing research on it to write their grant. It's a whole different ballgame. And so I think part of what Chuck just brought up is we can go hook up with those people who have that infrastructure and then use that as a vehicle to start getting our own feet on the ground. And realistically, when you talk about the practical parts of grant getting, that's probably one of the only ways we're going to start really making some movement in that area, because we do not have the resources and infrastructure that other people have had for decades already.
Well, I wish we had more time for questions, because I know you have some. Thank you very much.